Okay, hi everybody, and welcome to another Wildlife for You wildlife class. Tonight we're doing a really cool, awesome presentation that is called A Cub's Life, and it's all about becoming a bear. And what we're going to do, we are going to teach tonight's class, and it's going to be geared all towards black bears. I will tell you information about another class coming up that's also a Cub's Life, but that is going to be geared towards brown bears, or what we know as grizzly bears. But tonight's class is going to be a real treat. I want y'all to sit back, relax, keep your microphones muted. If you have any questions, by all means, you could put them in the chat box. I do have a friend joining me who's also an amazing wildlife person and professional. Her name is Stephanie. So if you see a response from Stephanie, accept that as a good response. But at some point, probably towards the end, we will answer questions. If you want to go on the microphone and ask me, that's fine too. But for the most part, sit back, relax. What I want to do is I want to teach you all about a Cub's life. And I'll give you the reason why I'm doing this particular webinar in a little bit. But glad you're here, glad you made it. Grab something to drink and enjoy and learn. So with that, I'm going to get started. And just so you know, the way we always start these Wildlife for You classes, depending on who's teaching them, I usually teach most of them, but we like telling all the students that are in these classes a little bit of background information about who their instructor is. And all of the instructors we have with Wildlife for You were professional wildlife biologists or professionals in the field of wildlife biology. And just so you know, a little background information about me. Again, my name is Daryl Radijak. Now, I received my degree in wildlife management a long, long time ago, so I am an old one here. But to give you an idea of some of the experience and education I have, besides that degree in wildlife management, one of the first jobs I had was working at a place called the Appalachian Bear Center. Many of you may know it now as the Appalachian Bear Rescue. A wonderful, wonderful place. I did that for about 5 years. That's where my passion of working with bears grew. But after that, it was time to get a little bit more secure job. I was starting a family. And so I went from there to working for the state of Tennessee, the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency. And because of my education and experience working with bears prior, I was soon promoted to be the bear, deer, and elk coordinator for the state of Tennessee. I did that for a while. They promoted me to chief of wildlife. So I was over all the animals in the state of Tennessee. Absolutely loved that. But then I started getting this pull to move west. As a little boy, I always loved the idea of the Rocky Mountains. And so 2015, I moved to New Mexico. I took a job with the U.S. Forest Service, working in an absolutely amazing, amazing place. I am still employed by the federal government doing lots and lots of wildlife work. So needless to say, I've got about 25 years of working with wildlife, and a great many of that is actually working with bears, especially with black bears. So let's begin the talk about a Cub's life. And so we're going to go back in time and start in the beginning. And so I would love to begin this talk talking about this bear here, but this particular bear is still a little bit too old. So let's go back in time a little bit more, maybe a month or two. And we get this bear who's maybe 10 or 12 pounds, but he too is still a little too big. So we're going to go back a little bit more. You get this little guy. He's about a 5-pounder, absolutely adorable. But that's not where I want to start the story. So if we go way, way back to when this cub first entered the world, that's pretty much what he looks like. But here's the thing, I don't even want to start at that point. This is actually where I want to start this discussion on a cub's life. And as you can imagine, you have a male and a female bear there. And this is where a cub's life begins. Because what's going to happen in the late spring, early summer, you're going to get this male and female bear together. And before you know it, you're going to hear Barry White playing in the background, and they're going to start thinking about what all wild animals and all humans eventually do is forming a family. And so at some point in time, like I said, usually around um, around June, maybe even early July, what's going to happen is mating is going to take place with an adult male and an adult female bear. And going back, I'm not going to go into too much biology, but this is going to be really important because when those two bears mate, you all know the biology of it, where you get an egg that is fertilized. And in almost every single animal there is, as soon as that egg becomes fertilized, it starts growing. And so one of the first things it does, it divides. And then it divides again, and it starts creating this multicellular, what we call a blastocyst. And so this happens literally within hours after fertilization. And so as this little bear, this tiny fertilized egg starts to develop, it starts developing, and within a couple of days, something unique happens. And this is pretty much only there, it's mostly in bears, but there are a few other species that it happens. But what happens is this thing called delayed implantation. And literally what that does is it stops that egg from dividing and from growing. And there's a really, really interesting reason for that. If anyone knows what bears do during the winter time, they hibernate. And so they don't spend a lot of time eating or drinking. Literally, they'll spend months where they're not eating or drinking anything. And when that occurs, those bears lose a lot of weight. It's extremely taxing on the body. So what happens is that's a female bear there. And this picture was taken in the summertime. If you look at her, she's rather skinny. And keep in mind, that is an adult bear. So she's of breeding age. And you can see how skinny she is. And so if that bear mates with a male bear and becomes pregnant in early June, she's going to start carrying these cubs, and it's going to be really, really taxing on her body because everyone knows, especially females, pregnancy is not a really easy thing to withstand. It's very taxing on the body. And so if she is underweight and she becomes pregnant, and then winter time comes around where she's going to have to hibernate and try to survive the winter without eating and being pregnant, it's not going to go very well. And so literally what this delayed implantation does, she will mate in that June, July time period, and that eggs, or those eggs that get fertilized within her body, they're going to stop developing. They're literally going to go into this suspended animation where they no longer begin to develop. They're kind of floating around with inside her uterus. What they need to do is, in order to keep going, they need to implant on the wall of her uterus, and that will give it all the nutrition it needs to begin growing, but it does not implant. So that bear's body, through this delayed implantation, literally holds those fertilized cells, those blastocysts that I mentioned before, and it holds them in suspended animation, waiting to see if she gets large enough to survive not only the pregnancy, but also survive the winter. So she has to put on a lot of weight. And so the cool thing with Mother Nature is they design these things so once you get around, say, October or November, the bear's body regulates itself and says, okay, we have enough fat on us, we can survive the pregnancy. So at that point, those eggs, those fertilized eggs, will implant on the uterine wall and begin growing again. So there's a couple of months in there where they don't grow at all. And then they wait until about November before they start growing again. And if you know anything about bears, they are usually born between, say, January or February. And I'll repeat that again. But since those eggs implant in November, and then those bears are born in January or February, they literally only have about 2 months of growing inside that female's body. And this is why little baby bear cubs, when they're born, they're only about a half a pound, maybe just a little more than half a pound. And think about it, that is crazy awesome, because just look at humans. You have a female, when she gives birth, a female could weigh anywhere from 100 pounds to who knows what. But oftentimes babies, human babies, are born weighing anywhere from 6 to potentially 9 pounds. And then you have this bear, which can be much larger than a human at times, but they're giving birth to something that only weighs about a half a pound. So that delayed implantation to help protect them to survive the pregnancy and the hibernation, that is why these bear cubs are born so small. So had to teach you something. All my talks, they're based in science. You'll learn something, but you're also going to see some pretty cool pictures coming up. So let's start with the cool stuff. And where we're going to start today, we are going to start in the den. And the one thing I do have to remind everyone is, yes, black bears hibernate. There's a lot of folks out there. I will absolutely lay the blame on us. There's been some wildlife biologists, or they might not have been biologists, but they were meaning well by describing the process that bears use. And they erroneously said bears don't hibernate. And they ended their sentence there. And unfortunately, it leads a whole bunch of people, especially in the Southeast, believing that black bears don't hibernate because it's too warm or there's not enough snow or something. Bears hibernate no matter where they are in North America. Bears just hibernate a little bit differently than most other hibernators. And I could explain that. I've got a whole nother webinar that can teach all that. But bears, black bears in particular, they do hibernate. And so we're going to start this story, this presentation. We're going to be inside a black bear den. And I want to show you what the inside of a black bear den looks like. That's what it looks like. Literally, you have to understand, a lot of bears will den in some pretty remote areas, crawl into this hole. And especially if you live in an area that gets snow and the opening of the hole covers up, it's pretty darn dark in a black bear den. And how do we know this? Well, believe it or not, we actually send people into black bear dens. I have worked with a number of folks. I myself have been on a number of den visits. But that's how we get the information that we're presenting to you today about how black bears hibernate, how they give birth, what is going on inside a black bear den. Just so you know, this is a buddy of mine, Carl Malcolm, Dr. Carl Malcolm. He is a brilliant researcher and ecologist that I used to work with, and I'm good friends with him. And he gave me a couple of these pictures, and I just love this picture of him halfway inside a black bear den. And so before we start talking about the cubs in particular, let's first start talking about where the cubs are born. And I want to talk a little bit about den selection, because they're very particular about what kind of den they use. And so whenever you talk about a bear den, I think this is what most people immediately draw their mind to. This big cave kind of reminds me of a Yogi Bear type of cave. Hold on, I got to mute somebody. It reminds me of a Yogi Bear cave where you kind of stand up and walk into that whole thing. But that's not really where they like to den, because they're looking for a couple of things in particular. One being, they want to find a den site that's going to be really tight, really hard to crawl into. So it's going to be a nice little tight space. And they also want to find a den site that's going to be pretty dry. And so the reason the bears prefer these den sites that are tight and dry is to help them conserve heat. I mentioned that black bears hibernate, so they've got to survive a long period of time, whether or not it's a couple of weeks or a couple of months, where they're going to be sleeping most of the time. And so that's going to take energy to keep the bear alive. And one of the biggest things that costs energy is maintaining that body temperature. So any added advantage of having a nice, tight, comfy, cozy place to sleep is really going to help them conserve energy. And so this picture right here that you see, is not what a typical bear den looks like. They don't walk into the back of those and just lay on the ground in the back of a big cave like that. This is actually what a typical bear den looks like. You probably walk by them 100 times and you don't even pay attention to them. But if it's something large enough where you can fit your head in or your head and shoulders, but that's about it, that is a likely place for a bear den. Those are perfect places for a bear to spend his time, his winter hibernating. Now, I will tell you, in the East, especially in those really heavily forested areas, Smoky Mountains, all up and down the Appalachian Mountains, black bears love to hibernate in these things. You wouldn't expect it, but they really, really do like to hibernate in trees. Now, for the most part, bears will find some kind of opening at the base of a tree, crawl in there, excavate it a little bit, might dig out a few things, and then crawl in and sleep within the tree or within the base of a tree throughout most of the winter. Now, they do get up occasionally, but that's a whole different webinar. You can ask Stephanie or anyone else how much I love talking about that topic. Anyway, that's a typical bear den. The cool thing is when we're doing research on these hibernating animals and we visit a den site where there's likely to be a hibernating bear, the cool thing is usually the researcher who is the smallest and tiniest is the one that is chosen to go inside the den to sedate the mother and to do a lot of the stuff. That immediately ruled me out because I couldn't fit in most areas. But it was definitely a really, really cool thing to visit a bear den site and to actually crawl in or peek your head into a lot of these amazing places where the bear's den. Now, just to give you an idea, here is another photo of a den site. I actually took this photo. This was over in the Townsend area, just outside of Great Smoky Mountain National Park. And believe it or not, that hole right there, you could barely get your head in there. There was actually a bear sleeping in the base of that tree as I took this picture. We didn't disturb it, but this is where the radio collar signal was coming from. And we walked up, peeked inside, and sure enough, the bear was still in there. So we left it alone, and we're going to come back. We were going to come back to do the actual study with the bear. And so that is a typical den site. Now, I will tell you, not all den sites are on the ground. Believe it or not, lots of bears hibernate inside the trees way up in the air. Doesn't matter if it's 10 feet, 15 feet, 20 feet. They will find holes like this where they can, again, get their head and shoulders in, crawl in, turn around, and spend pretty much most of the winter sleeping the days away. Now, the cool thing is in the East, especially where you have a lot of deciduous trees, which are the leaf-bearing trees, as opposed to the conifers, which are the pine trees. Those deciduous trees, many of them are susceptible to what's called a heart fungus, and it literally rots out the inside of the tree. Now, remember, the only thing that's alive on a tree is the outside of it, the bark and the cambium layer, but on the inside, it has already died. So even though this tree has this big, massive hole on the inside, the tree is alive and doing well. And oftentimes they create some wonderful, wonderful den sites for the bears. And so one of the cool things I've seen, I don't know if anyone else saw this, but a few years ago, there was a known den site in a tree in Yosemite National Park, and they set up a camera on it. Now, I will tell you, it was one of the most boring things you ever saw, but particularly because the bear was sleeping most of the time. But when the bear did emerge, it was pretty exciting to see a bear coming out of its den for the first time. So one thing I will mention, since some of you are coming from more warmer climates, those more southern latitudes, it does have an effect on their hibernation. They hibernate less and not as deeply. So their bodies will still slow down and they'll sleep most of the time for a matter of days or a matter of weeks in those more southern latitudes. So they might not even find a den site within a tree or a cave. What they might do is just have a nest on the ground. I've actually seen a bear nest. We recovered a collar. Wasn't as elaborate as this one, but they're just looking for a nice place to sleep and spend some time. And so they will just find some place that's nice and warm and cozy and kind of sleep most of the winter away. So with that, let's get into the best part of this topic or this talk. And we're going to talk about the cubs. And then suddenly there were cubs. All right, first things first, we're going to talk about cub birth. And I briefly mentioned this before, but all black bear cubs, they tend to be born between mid-January and early February. And as I mentioned before, black bears hibernate. So these cubs, these female bears, are giving birth in the middle of their hibernation when they're spending most of their time sleeping. And so when those cubs are born, like I said, they're really, really small, usually only just more than about half a pound. So they're tiny, tiny critters. And again, that is because their body waits for that fertilized egg to grow, and it doesn't start growing until November. And so from November to January is only a couple of months. And so when those cubs are finally born, they're really, really tiny critters. In fact, when they're born, just so you know, you can see in this photo here, their eyes are closed. These cubs are actually probably a week or two old because you see a full set of hair. On one of those pictures with the cub inside the gentleman's jacket, that was Dr. Mike Pelton, by the way. Cubs, for the most part, are born like a lot of the puppies and kittens, where they are mostly hairless. They do have some hair, but they still have a lot more hair to grow. So they're mostly hairless and their eyes are closed. And I'm going to throw out some jargon, some words that biologists throw around all the time, not realizing that no one knows what it means. But those cubs that are kind of helpless at birth, where their eyes are closed and they're highly dependent on mom, those animals are called altricial newborn, as opposed to, here's another technical term, precocial. Precocial animals are like deer, where they're born and within a few hours they're up and running around. Animals that are highly dependent on their mother's care are oftentimes born blind and hairless and pretty much helpless. Those are called altricial animals, and humans are the same way. So typically when the female gives birth, the number of cubs she gives birth to, on average, is going to be between 1 to 3 cubs. Now, there have been females that have given birth to 4 cubs. There have even been females that have given birth to 5 cubs. I will tell you that the number of cubs is usually correlates very well to the health of the mother. And the health is usually measured in how old she is and how big or how fat she is. So the bigger and fatter she is, the healthier she is. So the more cubs she can provide food for. And so those bigger moms tend to produce more cubs than, say, a mom who does not have a whole lot of extra mass on her. Now, like I said, they're born with their eyes closed. Again, those are those altricial cubs, but they'll soon open within a matter of a couple of days or a week or two. Now, I got to mention, at this time, those cubs, remember, moms sleep at most of the time. She will wake up and tend to them. But for the most part, when she gives birth in the den, in the middle of the dark, in the middle of nowhere, those cubs will crawl up on top of her and latch onto one of her breasts, and they will begin to nurse. And they pretty much stay nursing off of mom for a couple of months. And I've got to mention mom's milk, because mom's milk is truly special. We all are very aware of, like, the human breast milk or even cow's milk that some of you may have in your refrigerator. If you look at cow's milk, it roughly averages about 3 to 5% fat content. That's not bad. Some people think that's not good for you because it's too much fat. Well, if you look at bear milk, believe it or not, it's about 5 times richer and higher fat content than cow's milk. So it averages anywhere from 20 to 25% fat in it. And I will tell you that photograph of Carl Malcolm crawling in a den, he used to do a lot of those den studies, and he recalled a time he crawled into a den site with a nursing female bear. And as he was moving her within the den, she expressed some of the bear's milk, got all over his hands, And he said within 30 seconds after that milk kind of hit the cold air, it started congealing and solidifying. And he said before he knew it, it was like his hands were covered in butter. But that's how rich mom's milk is. And that's why these cubs love it so much. And they're going to grow so quickly from nursing off of mom. So needless to say, even though mom's in the middle of her hibernation, she does tend to her cubs. She's going to sleep a lot, but she's going to wake up, make sure they're cared for. She'll lick them, clean, she'll tend to them, and then go right back to sleep. And so there is a lot of activity. Even though she's spending most of her time sleeping, she doesn't just sleep solid throughout that whole birthing process. Now, I will tell you, here's a great photograph where you see a bear, a mother bear appears to be sleeping. She's got her cubs there. She's in a very, very shallow ground den. If you ever see something like this, don't approach, don't go near, because bears, although they hibernate, they do it a bit differently, and they maintain a really high body temperature as opposed to some of the other hibernating animals. And so, believe it or not, you approach this den, they hear a twig snap, they hear a human approach, they can wake up quickly. So by all means, if you know of a bear den, don't go by it. I don't want to call out photographers in general, because the photographers, most of them are great. They keep their distance, but you don't want to sit over a den site hoping each and every day you see some activity from that den, because wild bears get nervous from human presence and they don't want you around. And even if they don't appear nervous, you're simply habituating them. So if you know of a bear den site, by all means, don't go visiting it. Stay away and let the bear be a bear. Now, one of the things, I do want to keep this family friendly, but I also want to teach you about reality. And every season we're going to talk about, there's certain dangers that you have to watch out for. Now, when a female bear is in the den with her cubs, there's not many dangers. There's a lot less to worry about because she's pretty much sleeping the whole time the cubs are nursing off of her. Now, I will tell you, there are a few dangers. For example, if it's a young mother, especially, and she does not choose a very good den site, there's a risk of, for example, the den is in a low area and it gets flooded due to rains or melting snow. That is one of the dangers they face. They don't have too many predators looking out to go after those young cubs. They don't know where those den sites are. And so the bears, for the most part, are fairly safe now. They do have to worry about some of the natural events like the floods. And again, from people kind of getting too inquisitive, that's one of the things they've got to look out for as well. So needless to say, by April, so they're born January, February, they got a couple of months, March, all the way up to April. They're just nursing off mom and they're growing. At this point, they weigh a couple of pounds and they are ready to greet the world. And so that's going to move us on to the next season in their life. I just saw your comment, Stephanie. Yeah, I could talk about hibernation for quite some time. Anyway, this will move us to the next season. And so this takes us into the cubs' first spring, and it's what we call den emergence. Now, this usually occurs around April or May, might even be or late March if you're in a warmer climate. But typically April or May is when the females with their cubs come out of the den. Now, having said that, adult males or females that don't have cubs, they might come out of the den much earlier, but the last ones to emerge from the den are typically those females that have newborn cubs with them. And so this typically occurs around April or May. And when those cubs come out for the first time, they're usually less than 5 pounds, maybe 3 or 4 pounds. And that shows you how quickly they grow. When they're born in January, weighing a half a pound, and then suddenly they're 3 or 4 times, you're talking they're 8-10 times the size of when they were first born. And so they have grown a lot from just drinking off mother's milk, but they have a whole world before them. And so I do have a couple of pictures here. I put these pictures in because they're fantastic pictures, but it's the cub riding on the back of a female. I just want to let you know that's not normal. It happens every once in a while, but it's not like an opossum or anything where they typically travel on mom's back, but they do stay very close and attached to mom. Now, for the most part, as these cubs begin growing, the food that they're most likely to be eating is going to be mom's milk. They're still heavily dependent on mom. Mom is the main source of nourishment for these cubs. And so they're never going to be too far from her because that's what they're depending on to feed. Now, this is a great time for these cubs to begin learning how to be a bear. And there's certain behaviors that they're going to have to learn. There's also some behaviors that are what we call innate or instinctive. They don't have to be taught, they just know it. For example, knowing how to eat. But one of the biggest behaviors that they will learn at this point in their life is critical, and this is absolutely critical for black bears, not brown bears or grizzlies, but black bears. They learn how to climb at this age. And so literally they're about 5 pounds, and you wouldn't think that this tiny, tiny bear cub could know how to climb, but look at this. They're amazing climbers. Now, I will tell you one of the big differences between the brown bears and grizzlies and black bears is those brown bears have a different type of claw. Black bears, on the other hand, have this really short, sharp, curved claw, which is perfect for climbing. And so black bears use those claws the claws that they have in order to learn how to climb. Just to give you an idea how adept they are at climbing and being in trees, take a look at this picture. Love this picture because there's 3 cubs, maybe somewhere 7 or 8 pounds at most, and they're up in a tree, and all 3, well, 2.5 are sound asleep, just in the nook of the crannies of those branches. And the reason being climbing is so important for them is it's a safety thing. Mom teaches and urges them to begin climbing trees for the safety factor, and we'll get into why that safety factor is. But one of the things she will do is she'll begin teaching them all about communication, some vocalizations. When she makes a certain vocalization, those cubs will scamper up a tree. And she will teach those cubs, if there's danger around, whether or not it's a coyote, a bobcat, another adult bear, or in particular a human, she's going to send those cubs up in a tree for safety. And it's really, really important that they learn that. And so these bears, they're having a good old time being out and about from their den, but learning how to be a bear. And so climbing is really, really important at this stage of their life, because literally what they're doing, they're exploring, they're beginning to learn all about this new bear world that they're encountering. So what are the dangers at this point in time? So, okay, they've emerged from the den. They're usually with mom all the time. Mom will disappear for a little bit, but mom's never far. And whenever she does have to go away from the cubs, she's going to put them up in a tree. So what are the dangers? Well, believe it or not, this is one of the most susceptible times for these young cubs. It's because they're only about 5 pounds, 5 to 10 pounds. And so they can make an easy meal for another predator, whether or not it is a coyote or a bobcat, or I mentioned it before, another bear that's not its mom, especially the adult males. Sometimes they'll go after these young cubs because they're small, they're like a prey item. So they can become a prey item for another predator. I was going to say something, now I forgot it. Don't get old because you lose things on the tip of your tongue. Anyway, this is the time of the year when the cubs are really susceptible to getting killed, because they're out on their own, and especially if mom walks away, it could be bad because other predators can go after those cubs. Now, having said that, I will tell you, when I worked at the Appalachian Bear Center. One of the biggest calls I got was people would call in because they would look out their window and there's 2 or 3 tiny cubs in a tree in their yard. And they would call up and say, Mom's not around, you got to come rescue them, they're orphaned. And I can almost guarantee you in every situation, they were not orphaned. Mom does not leave them for too long. She intentionally puts them up in a tree for their safety because it's most important that mom finds some food. She nourishes her body because as long as she is healthy, she is providing milk that these cubs need. And so they are not orphaned. Typically, mom is around, and you can see, I love this picture because when mom's around, the cub is safe. The cub's not going to be messed with by any other predator, not any other human. And so they stay close to mom, but in some situations where mom has to feed, she'll put them in the safety of trees. And like I said, they love being in trees, and they're quite adept at sleeping up there, staying up there, just waiting for mom to get back. And so absolutely amazing pictures. And these are probably the kind of bears that most people love to see because you gotta admit they're pretty darn adorable. So with that, we're going to move to the next season in a bear's life. So that was their first spring. Now let's move to what I call the lazy days of summer. And this is really where these cubs start becoming a bear. And the days I'm talking about, or the time period I'm talking about, is primarily from about June to August. So peak of the summer. Now, at this time of the year, these cubs are going to weigh anywhere between 5 to 25 pounds. And so this particular bear, he's rather small. He's anywhere 7 to 8 pounds here, but they can be all the way up to 25 pounds. That all depends on how much food that mom is providing them. So if mom's doing a good job and nursing them or teaching them what to eat, those cubs will grow fast. So there's a lot of variability between how big the cubs are at this time of the year, depending on how experienced the mom is. Now, I will tell you, when it comes to food, mom's milk is still going to be the primary source, but she's going to begin introducing these solid foods, these foods that the bears can find for themselves. And so I will tell you that most of the foods that bears eat, they're classified as omnivores, which means they eat both vegetable material and meat. Most of what a bear's diet consists of is mostly vegetation. So at this time of the year, the bears are going to be eating a lot of grasses, a lot of leaves. But one of the things they really like during the midsummer is what you see this bear feeding on here. You can't see what it's feeding on really close, but believe it or not, I love this picture. That is a black bear, just so everyone knows. It's a blonde-ish colored black bear. This was taken by a friend of mine in Colorado, because not all black bears are black. But you see that young bear feeding on berries or these things. Now, oftentimes you're going to hear biologists talk about the mast crop. There's a soft mass, which is the berries, the crop of berries. Sometimes they will talk about hard mast, which is the nut crop. But that's the jargon that my colleagues sometimes mention without realizing that people might not understand what they're talking about, but it's pretty much the berry crop. Now, again, these bears are going to be learning constantly from mom. Learn behaviors, some of the innate behaviors to run from danger, to do all these sorts of things. And so they're really learning about communicating in the bear world. So mom's still teaching them vocalizations. If you take any of our other bear classes, I teach a lot of bear behavior classes. So there's specific warnings, from jaw popping to huffing, to bluff charges, all sorts of things. They're learning all this stuff from mom on how to be a bear. And so at this point in time, what are the dangers? Well, again, they do have to worry about some predation, because especially an adult male bear could still prey on the cubs, even though they're growing in size. When they get to be about 25 pounds, those coyotes and those bobcats kind of like, hey, I'm not going to mess with that. I see the claws on this thing, so I'm not going to mess. So for the most part, from the predation standpoint, you have other adult bears who can still overwhelm this animal. But one of the biggest dangers for the cubs at this time of the year, it's simply because they're gaining more independence. They start spending more time away from mom and exploring their world and getting into stuff that they shouldn't get into. Think of them like the teenagers. I should tell you, I was thinking about this class earlier today, and I was trying to relate it to humans. Now, I will tell you, like when you have a baby, a human baby that's totally dependent on you, they don't get into trouble much. They sit in their crib or wherever you put them. They can't really do anything except cry and tell you when they're hungry or when something's wrong. But as soon as that little human baby can crawl, that elevates a whole level of responsibility for you, because you turn your back on them and they're eating out of the dog food bowl. So not that I'm speaking from experience, but the older they get, the more mischievous they get. And at this age, these bears are what I liken that 12-year-old to the young teenager. They're just getting into everything that they shouldn't be getting into. And so that leads to more dangers. And besides that predation from other adult bears, there's just natural dangers out there. Say there has been heavy rainstorms and these bears are wandering around and they fall into a swollen river. Really dangerous for the bear. So they can get themselves into some of these unfortunate predicaments simply because they're more independent. They're doing more exploration. They're spending more time away from mom. And remember, mom is their big protector. She keeps an eye on them. And so it's really important that these cubs stay out of trouble and just get through this phase of life, because they're learning a whole lot. And if they do it right, the lazy days of summer, they'll spend the day exploring, and then they're going to spend the rest of the day sleeping up in a tree where it's nice and safe. So it's a good time to be a young bear cub, as long as you can stay out of trouble. This takes us to the next season of the bear's life, and I call it doing the fall shuffle. And pretty much what this is crunch time for the bear. The time period I'm talking about, usually from September to November. Now, at this time, depending on how good that mother was at providing food or showing them where food was, these cubs could be highly variable in weight, from 25 pounds all the way up to 75 pounds. And so you see some really good, healthy cubs here. These are bears that have gotten into a great food source. Now, I will show you this photograph. These are these are those young bears when they get a tremendous food source. This was actually taken at that Appalachian Bear Center that was releasing the cubs, and their goal is to fatten up the cubs. And so if they get into a lot of food, they can absolutely grow. You have to understand, wild bears, if you see wild bears that look like this, the sad fact of the matter is they probably got into an unnatural food source like garbage or other human provided foods. And so at this point in time, the bears are mostly eating solid foods. Sometimes they'll drink off of mom or have a snack off of mom, but for the most part, they're eating primarily solid foods. And I don't know if you can see it in the picture, but this is what we would call that hard mess. This is the nut crop. For the most part, it's going to consist of acorns, but they'll eat any kind of nut that there's out there. Hickory nuts, walnuts. Acorns are usually the most plentiful and easiest to eat, so they begin gorging themselves on the acorns because it's really, really healthy, energy-packed food. Now, the reason I call it the crunch time and doing the fall shuffle is because these bears have to start putting on weight. We spent a good time at the beginning of this presentation talking about bear hibernation. All bears will do it, and the best way to survive hibernation is to pack on the pounds. And so this fall time period between September and November is when they have to pack on the pounds. So the cool thing is that nut crop is like little bursts of energy and fuel that they can eat and start packing on that extra fat that they'll need for the wintertime. Now, behaviorally, they know pretty much all there is to know. They're still practicing. They're still learning what the dangers are. I don't know if you can see in the top far left corner, there is another larger bear approaching. So these bears are still wary about other dangers, but they're still learning how to be a bear. Now, I'm going to go back to this whole eating thing because, again, you'll hear some jargon, you'll hear some words that you're probably not used to. Sometimes people will mention bears going into hyperphagia, and that's translated, I believe it's Greek, which is translated as a feeding frenzy. And so during this fall time, the bears are driven to eat as much as possible. If they're good wild bears, they're eating lots of that hard mast, but they're trying to find whatever nutritious foods they can find. And this leads us into the dangers at this time of the year. And I will tell you, this is where the humans really amp up the danger factor for bears, because bears at this time, remember, they're driven to eat and they're trying to find whatever food. And humans are often careless with the storage of their garbage. They're also often intentional with feeding bears because they look cute. Both ways, humans are at fault when bears get into areas or access to human foods. It will absolutely help their body out and packing on the pounds, but they become what we call food conditioned. And we mean they get used to those human foods. And so they'll become more used to being around humans. They'll become more used to being in developed areas. And there's so many more dangers that they're exposed to. They can get hit by cars. They could get attacked by dogs. They could get accidentally or intentionally poisoned. There's just so many more dangers when they're around people that this is probably the biggest danger time of their life, because they could get used to being around people. So anyway, if mom has done a great job, mom is still with these cubs. So if mom, they're about 8 or 9 months old, you can see from this picture. I love this picture because they're big, healthy bears getting ready for going into den. And that next phase of the season is then comes winter. And so again, bears are going to hibernate. This is their downtime. This is where they're going to spend a whole bunch of time sleeping, relaxing. They're not going to be eating. They're not going to be drinking. And just so you know, a clarification regarding hibernation, it has nothing to do with snow. It has nothing to do with cold temperature. It has everything to do with the lack of food. And so even if you live in the Smoky Mountains or in some of the warmer climates, you all know that the trees, the deciduous trees, they lose their leaves, they go dormant. There's not a lot of plants growing because it's much cooler temperatures. Sometimes you do get snow, but there's not, if the bears are eating vegetation, there's not a lot of food there. And so they evolved to hibernate in the wintertime to pass the time when there's not a lot of food resources available. So the time we're particularly talking about, usually between December and March, they'll begin shutting down and finding a place where they're going to sleep for a while until spring green up happens. And for the most part, the cubs, they're going to be denning with mom again. Again, for anyone that is not familiar with bears on the western side of the US, not all black bears are black. This one is an adult female black bear, even though she's brown. And that's her cub. That's her yearling cub, or close to yearling, that's going to go back into den with her. And so this first time that the winter comes around, those cubs are going to go sleep in the same den with their mom. And again, we call bears super sleepers by the way they hibernate. And I teach a class called Super Sleepers, and like Stephanie said, I can talk forever on the way they hibernate. But if you're looking at this winter time, this denning time, when they're spending most of their time sleeping the winter away, you look at the dangers. Again, there's not many dangers because they're tucked away somewhere in a den. Now, I will tell you, occasionally bears select inappropriate, or I shouldn't say inappropriate. It's appropriate for them, but it's inappropriate for humans. Sometimes they'll den underneath someone's porch. or in a high traffic area where there's lots of humans around. And so those are pretty much the only dangers that they'll get into, is if they select a poor den site. Because remember, they're going to spend most of their time tucked away, just sleeping the winter away. So as the time goes by, the next spring arrives, and that mom, and I use the same picture because I love the picture, but it's their second spring. Finally gets here, brand new start. Mom emerges from the den with her cubs in tow. You can see they're big, not like when they were newborn cubs that were coming out weighing only 5 pounds. These bears are what we call yearlings. So they're already at least a year old, and they come out of the den with the mom in the springtime. And so if mom has done a good job, this is what those yearlings look like. They're nice, well-rounded, healthy bears that are ready to start being a new bear. And like I said, as long as mom has done a good job, these bears are well equipped. They've been learning all those behaviors. They've been learning, they fed off mom, but they're learning what to feed on because mom was teaching them about the berry crops, the nut crops, everything that they need in order to survive being a bear. And mom considers herself pretty happy. She just raised a whole bunch of new cubs. They're now yearlings. They're those 20-year-olds that are just anxious to live on their, like the 20-year-old is a human reference, that want to be out on their own. And mom wants them to be out on their own, because as mom's looking at the cubs that she raised and are now yearlings, guess what she starts thinking about? A little thought pops in her mind. Yeah, and sure enough, good old Barry White starts playing in the background with his smooth, sultry voice. And so she's like, all right, I'm done with these cubs. Time for them to go. And so mom will try to encourage the cubs to leave on their own. And just so you know, I just added these pictures earlier today because I got them from a gentleman, Steve Helms. He just captured these photos a couple of days ago. But here was a mom with a yearling bear in tow, and it was time for the yearling bear to leave. And you can see, kind of pitiful, the yearlings looking for mom, but mom is ready to breed again. And so mom will be adamant to chase her offspring away. It's not always the prettiest thing because she'll get aggressive. She wants to do everything in her power to get these yearlings away from her. There's a couple of reasons for that. The primary reason is because if she's going to be mating again, she's going to be drawing in these large adult males. These large adult males don't like offspring, especially when they're not their own offspring, and they will kill. Even though this is a slightly larger bear, that yearling would be in jeopardy if mom attracts a big adult male. So she is going to do whatever she can to get that young yearling to go out on her own. And so I know a lot of people on Facebook, they get so sad seeing this, but this is the way of life for a bear. It's about being a bear. And with that, she's going to chase them away. She's going to breed again. And guess what, folks? That whole cycle of life begins again. And so that is the end of this presentation. And I'm going to sit here and I'll answer questions as much as you want. Before I do that, I really do have to tell you that there's some amazing photographers that donated a lot of the pictures that I list there. You could always go back and look at this recording and see who they were. As I started this presentation, I did tell you that Wildlife for You, we do these presentations all the time. The easiest thing to do is follow us on Facebook. I will say my partner on here, Stephanie, who I believe has been answering questions in the chat box. We do a podcast. If you ever like listening to podcasts, I'm going to blame her completely that we kind of dropped the ball lately, but we have a whole bunch of podcasts available to listen to on Spotify. So if you want to listen to that, easiest thing to do, if you like this presentation, we offer them all the time. Again, we do have memberships for this because we do like offering our biologists something for their time and trouble, as well as we have to pay to maintain the website and everything else that goes into maintaining this business. But follow us on Facebook. I'm going to be doing a special for people, introductory thing for you to become a member and get access not only to the live presentations like you're seeing now, but we also have a library of over 70 wildlife classes that if you become at least a 6-month member, you get every one of those classes as a recording. It's not live, but it's a recording. So anyway, I will tell you, mark your calendars. We're going to do the next one that's going to be free to the public once again throughout the month of June. But the next class I'm going to teach, still going to be a Cubs life, but instead of talking about black bears, we are going to talk about brown bears, also known as grizzlies. And they do things they do a lot of things similar, but there's definitely some things that are different between a brown bear and a black bear. And so that is going to be 2 weeks from tonight. It will be on June 21st, same time. It'll be a different link. So look at the Facebook page to see that. But with that, I'm going to thank you and ask if there's anyone that has questions. And I'll be, if you want to unmute yourself, well, let me call on you first. If you, Stephanie, do you have anything to add? Or
I was going to say there was actually no questions in the chat. I did add some minor commentary that's just to reiterate what you've already said, or spell it out in case they were curious. For example, if it was, is that soft mass or soft mast? I don't understand. So I did try to spell those out. I did make a sidebar that they, I'm surprised you didn't comment on it with all those gorgeous pictures.
the blue eyes.
That bears are born with blue eyes. Yeah, as are many animals. So that's just lacking the melanin, which will develop once they start to get out and about and they begin to darken. So I also provided a little distinguishing factor between the difference of a koi versus a yearling, but no questions.
Well, I'm here, Stephanie. That now you answered everything well. Now you know why I pay you the big bucks.
Wait,
I will double your salary after today. Anyway, if anyone has any questions, feel free to unmute yourself.
Hey, Daryl.
Hey, Sue, how you doing?
I'm doing fine. I have a question. I have a new phone. I don't know how to use it. I've been trying to send a question, but obviously I'm not doing it correctly. But isn't it unusual for cubs to stay with their mother as long as 399 kept her last batch?
Excellent question, Sue. 399.
Didn't she keep them for 3 years?
No, I'll explain that. So 399, for those that don't know, is a famous female bear in Yellowstone. One of the reasons why she's so famous, she was collared a long time ago. She was 24 years old, and everyone thought she was pretty much done giving birth, because usually the early to mid 20s, the females, that's a really old grizzly, and they didn't think she'd have any more cubs. Lo and behold, when she was 24 years old, she emerged from the den and she had 4 grizzly bear cubs, which is almost unheard of. It has happened before, but it was such an oddity that she emerged with 4 cubs, and she was a fantastic mother. And so she raised these cubs. They stayed with her all that first year. One of the differences, and I'll talk about this in 2 weeks when we talk about brown bears. One of the differences is the brown bears tend to keep their cubs with them for 2 years. So after they give birth, they'll go back into the den with their mom when they're close to a year old. She keeps them a whole nother year after that. And then they go back many times, not all the time, but many times they'll go back into the den for that second year. So they're 2 years old when they're back into the den. And then when they leave the den that following spring is when the breakup occurs. And just so you know, this past spring, just a couple of weeks ago, Grizzly 399 emerged with her 4 2-year-old cubs now, and just a few weeks ago she kicked them out and dispersed them because she was going to be coming into heat, and she does it to protect her cubs, because adult males, which we had a few unfortunate incidents in Yellowstone, but adult males will kill either a cub or yearling or even 2 or 3-year-old bears that aren't their offspring. And so excellent question, Sue. I'll cover that more in depth 2 weeks from today when we talk about brown bears.
Okay, thanks.
You're very welcome. All right, I do see a question. Michael Burton said, can you speak about any states that have reasonable hunting regulations when it comes to black bears? We just had our first black bear season in Missouri this past year. Now, I will tell you that hunting of bears often triggers a lot of emotions. There's lots of people that hate it, some people that love it. As someone who watches over a resource, those animals, the states, what they do is they set hunting season on certain animals, and bears are one of those hunted species. Now, it is used as a way to control their population, because one of the things, you're not going to believe this, we have done surveys in the past that will ask a question, and these are just everyday average Joe respondents that say, do you want bears in your state? Almost everybody, it's like close to 90% of people say, yes, love bears. We want bears around. Then the next question would be, do you want bears in your county? And that drops a little lower, only 70%. Then it goes, do you want bears in your town? And fewer people like that. Then the last question was, do you want bears in your backyard? And then people, no, I want bears over there. I don't want them in my backyard. And so these state wildlife agencies have to manage the populations. We call it human carrying capacity. Bears will keep growing in population, but there's a certain number of bears that the human population will tolerate. And that is the difficult task that state wildlife agencies have, is to keep those bear populations so the public doesn't say, I'm sick of bears, there's too many, they're getting into my garbage can, they're killing this, they're doing that. We want the public to love bears. And so there's a certain amount of bears that's really, really good, but having too many bears can begin to sway that public opinion. Hope I did a good job explaining that. And so they set hunting seasons. Now, hunting seasons are different in every state. I can't say which ones do it good, which ones do it bad. They're just trying to accommodate the people that live in their state. And I'll leave it at that. Stephanie, do you want to add anything to that, being another biologist on here?
I think Stephanie left.
Oh, okay. It's past her bedtime. Thanks for that, Piper. Anyway, I'll leave it at that. So does anyone else have a question they want to ask by unmuting themselves? I'm going to look through the chat to see if there's anything else.
I just typed mine in the chat, but I can ask you here. If
Yeah,
that
go
makes it
go
easier.
ahead, Moth.
So I'm in this photo with the bear. Do you know if those are ticks all over it? Do black bears often experience problems with heavy tick loads?
Yeah, well, this picture, I don't believe those are ticks. I believe the bear has probably gone through a briar patch, and you remember where Robert took us in the Appalachians, there's some thick vegetation that will stick to your clothes.
Right.
I have a feeling that's what's in this picture, but having said that, yes, all animals are susceptible to getting that parasite load, which includes ticks. Bears, there's a few animals that exhibit it, but sometimes you will see bears that almost appear hairless. They lose big clumps of hair, and it doesn't look good. It looks pretty awful. That is often attributed to mange, which is caused by this tiny infestation of these mites. And so, although I don't believe that's what you see in the picture, yes, bears can get ticks and mites and all these other creepy crawlies that are kind of freaky to think about. But when you're living out in nature, there's a lot of things that can affect you. All right.
One more question for you.
Go ahead, Sue.
Are you going to have another one of these on bear behavior?
I probably will. My favorite class of all, and in fact, I was planning on doing a class called The Language of Bears, which is all about bear behavior and how they not only speak to each other, but speak to us.
Right.
I don't have it scheduled yet, but when I do, it will probably be another class that's open to the public, because I think it's really, really important for the public to learn about bears. Now, I understand that a lot of our classes will teach classes on cougars and wolves and different aspects of bears that will be part of our membership package. But yes, I'll probably do one it's called The Language of Bears.
Okay.
Okay, so Michael asked if I know anything about the repopulation of black bears in Arkansas. I don't know in depth as far as the numbers, but I will tell you bears throughout most of North America were extirpated or locally killed out, because when the Europeans came over, we were great at exploiting wildlife. And when I say great, it means we were awful at exploiting wildlife. And so we killed out a lot of animal populations. And where bears survived, especially in the East Coast, east of the Mississippi River, but even into Arkansas and the whole Midwest, they survived in those remote areas. So in the East Coast, the Appalachian Mountains is where they hung on. It was probably because humans couldn't get to them to completely kill them out, thankfully. In Arkansas, you have the Ozarks, some of those more remote areas where they hung on. I know you have, I think, White River Refuge down there as well. And so the cool thing is, even though they hung on for about 100 years, with the onset of state wildlife agencies in the mid 1900s and all these regulations protecting bears, like even establishing a hunting season means you couldn't just kill them anytime. There was only a certain time. The bear populations began to grow. And what we're seeing nowadays, everyone thinks well, I shouldn't say everyone. A lot of people think bear populations are declining. They're actually growing crazy gangbusters, especially in those eastern states. The bear populations are expanding. And so Arkansas, I know Arkansas, Missouri, Mississippi, a lot of those states, even in those Midwestern areas, are starting to see more and more bears. In fact, Sue, who has asked a question, I know Sue from a famous bear, a black bear called Bruno, that made a trip from Wisconsin all the way down to Louisiana. And so black bears are being seen in more and more places where they haven't been seen in 100, sometimes 200 years. Michael, going back to the question about the bear hunting is just it's a real trick. It's a real tricky thing as far as what states do it right. I think what you have to look at are the states that do it scientifically, that have a real good grasp and handle on how many bears there are and how many bears they want there to be. So some states don't have a lot of good data, and they're kind of just winging it. And unfortunately, I don't know how Missouri does it, but if you look in depth, I think the states that do it right are the ones that base it off science and really good information. Tom, you made me laugh with you want bears in your backyard. I love bears. I love living in bear country, but when it goes to the everyday average Joe and average Jane, seeing a bear in their backyard causes them quite the scare sometimes. All right, Janice says, seems like black bears had larger family this past 2 years than I've been seeing in a long time. Saw a lot of 3 and 4 cubs per mama. Seems mama bears are doing great. Janice, that is such an excellent point. I should have brought this up. Remember what I said, like the fall time is when it's that fancy word, hyperphagia, where bears are really trying to pack on the pounds for the hibernation. If you have a good year with acorns, a real good nut crop, all of those females that were bred in the summertime, they have access to lots and lots of food. So if you have a good acorn crop or a good nut crop, all those pregnant females will blow up and get a lot of fat on them. And so when they go into the den, because they're so healthy going in or so fat going into the den, their body is going to say, all right, all these eggs that are implanted or all these eggs that are fertilized, we're going to implant in the uterus. And so the fatter she is, the more cubs she'll give birth to. And so in those years where you have really good acorn crops, that following spring, you're going to see lots and lots of cubs. All the females that were pregnant are going to be giving birth to 2, 3, sometimes 4 cubs. Converse of that, if you have a year where you don't have a lot of good acorn production and there's not a lot of food available for the bears, that following spring, the moms were going to be a little underweight going into hibernation. So they might have aborted some of those eggs and maybe only 1 cub or sometimes no cubs. And so it all depends on how much food was available that previous fall. If there's a lot of food, lots of those females are going to have lots of cubs. If there wasn't much food, you're not going to have as many cubs that following spring. And so you could have some big fluctuations in bear populations based on the amount of food that was available in the fall. Gerald, you mentioned commonly called beggar's lice. When I took the Western students to Tennessee, we gave them an introduction into beggar's lice because a couple of our teachers were throwing it at them. Oh, fantastic question by Karen. Karen asked, if a sow can mate with multiple bears, is it possible to have cubs sired by different fathers within a litter? Absolutely, yes. So when the female bear comes into heat or is getting ready to mate in, say, June or early July, when she comes in, she's going to draw lots of male bears to her because males are males. That's what they do. And so she's going to have an opportunity, and she is going to be bred by multiple male bears. And so within her body, there might be eggs that are fertilized by different males. And so provided she gets enough food that fall, those eggs are going to implant, and the ones that implant could absolutely be from different fathers. So that's the crazy thing to think about. When she gives birth in the den and that following spring, those cubs emerge, she could have 3 cubs and all could have different fathers, which is a great thing from, don't want to get too technical, but for genetic diversity, it's a great thing. I could talk all night long about bears, so I better stop there. But yes, great question. Yes, they could all be sired by different fathers. All right, North Carolina is doing a study right now in Asheville, and they're seeing 4 and 5 cubs in a litter. Okay, so what Gerald's saying is they're seeing more and more bears being born, and they're also seeing younger females. Typically, a female usually wouldn't give birth until she was about 4 years old or maybe 5 years old. Sometimes they could do it younger. And as Gerald mentioned, they're seeing 2 and 3-year-old females getting pregnant now. It's a good thing in that the bear population can grow so fast when the younger females are giving birth and they're giving birth to more cubs. The one thing I will warn you, Gerald, about that is what we're seeing oftentimes is bears that have access to human foods have obviously more food resources available. Those tend to be the ones that are fatter. Those are the ones that are giving birth to more cubs. They're becoming sexually mature because they're so much healthier. And unfortunately, it's an artificial situation. It's because they have access to human provided foods. I will tell you, and I mentioned it earlier, that hibernation is often dictated by the lack of food resources. It's not the cold or the snow, it's the lack of food. And what they're seeing, and there's a study, I think, up near Seattle or somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, they're seeing the bears that have access to human foods, they're hibernating less and less. They're spending less time sleeping in the wintertime. And so you might have bears that are active pretty much all winter long. When they have year-round access to food, they have no reason to sleep. And so unfortunately, Gerald, as positive as it is, and the fact that you're seeing a lot more bears, more cubs, more females giving birth, it could be a bad sign in that it's indicative of those bears having unnatural food sources. I didn't even read the rest of your comment, Gerald, but yeah, you hit the nail on the head. Jenny, don't apologize for anything. If you can observe a den from a distance and have no impact, and I imagine that's what you did in Yellowstone. Unfortunately, we've had instances where people have gotten too close to get photographs and they keep revisiting the den and going right up to the den. That's what we're trying to avoid. If you know where there's a bear den site, like up on a hill that you can view from a long distance, by all means, enjoy it. As long as you're not interacting with that bear and that bear knows that you're there right outside the den, there's no harm in that. So I have complete faith in you, Jenny. It's the folks that are just they're too into nature and think they're one with nature, that they could go right up to these dens and not disturb these bears. That's what we're trying to eliminate, because unfortunately there are people like that. Yeah, I saw pictures of that den site. It looked like it was pretty high up on a hill there, Jenny. All right. Does anyone else have any other questions? Like I said, feel free to unmute yourself, but I think I've got through most of these in the chat box. I'm going back looking through them. All right. All right, Janice, you go. Your battery's dying. The gas is running low in my tanks anyway. I haven't eaten. I came straight from work. So thank you again for joining us. Follow us on Wildlife for You. I'll have more information about upcoming classes and if you want to become a member and get all those recordings. But thank you again. You guys are awesome. This is why we do this. And you can see these are some of the classes we've taught over the years. So remember, and we always say this in our podcast, when it comes to wildlife, your knowledge is often their existence. So keep at it, folks, and keep getting smarter and smarter.
Daryl, somebody had one more question in the chat.
What was it?
Whether something about whether brown bears.
And do brown bears? Yeah, Tom. I'm sorry, I just saw it now. Do brown bears stay with their mother longer than black bears? Yes, they do. Usually, instead of a year and a half, the brown bears will stay with their mom for 2.5 years. It doesn't happen all the time. Sometimes I think there's even been record them staying up to 3 years, but that is one of the big differences in how they do it. And my next slideshow on June 21st is going to be all about brown bears. It'll be a similar one to this, but it'll have all grizzly pictures throughout it. So don't miss that. And we'll talk about some things that are different between brown bears and black bears. So hope you tune in. And thanks for that, Sue. All right, I'm going to stop the recording and hope to see you in a couple weeks.